You know, in the 1800s, America had this huge, optimistic dream to stretch all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But what if that very dream, that push westward, was actually planting the seeds for the nation's worst nightmare? Let's get into it and see how that journey west accidentally paved the road to the Civil War.
So what we're going to do here is trace that exact path. We'll start with that incredible era of westward expansion, then dive into the massive political fights over slavery that it kicked off, and see how it all led, step by step, to the outbreak of the Civil War. It's a story about hope, but it's also about a country pulling itself apart.
Okay, so first, let's set the scene. In the 19th century, America was basically in full-on expand mode. It was a nation just bursting at the seams, and everyone's eyes were locked on the West.
So why was everybody heading west? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm of reasons. You had the simple pull of opportunity. I mean, who doesn't want cheap, fertile land? Then there was the discovery of gold, which was like a shot of adrenaline for the whole country. But underneath all of that was this powerful idea called manifest destiny, this belief that America was supposed to stretch across the continent, that it was its destiny. And the government? It threw gasoline on the fire. You have the Homestead Act, which basically gave away free land. The Morrill Act helped fund colleges by selling land. And the whole thing was being stitched together by the brand new Transcontinental Railroad. It was a massive national project.
But here's the thing. All this expansion, all this new land, it created a huge, and I mean huge, problem. With every new territory that was claimed, one single explosive question got louder and louder.
And that was it. This was the question. It hung over everything, every debate in Congress, every election. Would these new lands be free, or would they allow slavery? It sounds like a simple question, right? But as it turned out, it was pretty much impossible for the country to answer, at least not without tearing itself in two.
Now, for a little while, politicians thought they had a really clever way out of this mess. They called it popular sovereignty. The idea was, hey, let's take this hot potato out of Washington's hands. We'll just let the people who actually move to these new territories vote on it themselves. It sounds super democratic, right? Let the people decide. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as we'll see, it was a total recipe for disaster.
And here's why it was so difficult. You had two sides that were just fundamentally opposed to each other. On one side, you have the abolitionists. For them, this was a moral issue, plain and simple. Slavery was evil and it absolutely could not be allowed to spread. But on the other side, especially in the South, you had pro-slavery groups who believed that their entire economy, their whole way of life, depended on slavery. There was just no middle ground here. These were two worldviews that could not coexist.
So with the country split right down the middle, Congress did what it could. It tried to keep things from exploding with a series of political compromises. But these weren't real solutions. Think of it like putting a tiny Band-Aid on a massive wound. It's just not going to hold for long.
And you can really see the whole thing falling apart when you look at this timeline. Back in 1820, you get the Missouri Compromise, which drew a literal line across the map to separate future free and slave states. That worked for a bit. Then in 1850, another big compromise tried to make everybody happy. But then, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act comes along and basically throws out the old rules, bringing back that popular sovereignty idea. And then, the real bombshell, the Dred Scott decision in 1857, where the Supreme Court basically declared that slavery couldn't be banned anywhere. Each attempt to fix the problem just made things 10 times worse.
And this is where things take a really dark turn, because this fight wasn't just about words and votes anymore. It was about to get violent.
That Kansas-Nebraska Act, it turned Kansas into an absolute battleground. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers just poured into the territory, not to farm, but to fight for control. This whole period was so brutal, it became known as Bleeding Kansas. It was basically a miniature civil war, and it proved that popular sovereignty was a complete and utter failure. All it did was move the conflict from the halls of Congress to the open frontier. So after decades of these failed deals and seeing real violence break out, the country was at its absolute breaking point. Those fragile bonds that were holding the whole thing together were about to just snap.
And man, when the end came, it came fast. It was like a set of dominoes tipping over. First, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency on a platform of stopping the spread of slavery. For the South, that was it. That was the last straw. Believing their entire way of life was under attack, they started to secede, one by one. And then, in April 1861, those first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun.
The war itself was 4 long, brutal years. The North's main strategy was called the Anaconda Plan. The idea was to blockade the South and basically choke its economy to death. But over time, the whole purpose of the war shifted.
When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it wasn't just about preserving the Union anymore. It became a fight to end slavery. You had massive turning points, like the Union wins at Vicksburg and Gettysburg that really changed the tide of the war. And through it all, you had Lincoln, with speeches like the Gettysburg Address reminding everyone what all this sacrifice was for.
So by 1865, the fighting finally stops. The Union had won, it had survived, but the country was scarred, it was broken, and now it was facing an entirely new and, frankly, overwhelming challenge.
And so, that was that. The Confederacy was defeated. Slavery, the institution that had torn the country apart, was finally being destroyed. The question that started with westward expansion was finally answered in the most brutal way imaginable.
But winning the war left behind a question that was, in some ways, even harder. The fighting was over, but the peace was just getting started. And it leaves us with this huge, lingering thought. How in the world do you rebuild a nation that just finished tearing itself apart?